Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down this week in your backyard and across the world. Welcome to People's Republic. I, of course, am Brian Griffith, and this week we are talking about the push to repeal New Mexico's abortion ban that's going on throughout New Mexico. We are specifically joined from Albuquerque by Candice Yanez, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We're going to be talking about the kind of state of affairs within New Mexico, the existing laws on the books, and what significance that might have for the way we kind of organize around reproductive rights and these kind of justice issues. So, yeah, joining us, as mentioned, is Candice Yanez. Thank you very much, Candice, for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brian, for having me on.
Very glad to have you on. Can we start by talking about what the kind of pre-Roe versus Wade abortion ban in New Mexico is, what the kind of significance of it is, and basically like how draconian are we looking at, and what are kind of the stakes when we're talking about trying to repeal an abortion ban that is at least officially it's still on the books, but from my understanding, like with Roe versus Wade, it's kind of no longer in effect, but it seems like that could kind of come back if it seems likely that Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned by the Supreme Court.
So New Mexico has this abortion ban, and it's a 50-year-old law that dates back from 1969, and it bans abortion in almost all cases except very near a few. For example, the exceptions are cases of rape or incest. And like you had said, the only thing keeping the ban from being enforced here in New Mexico is the 1973 Supreme Court decision in Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. So the concern is that it is becoming more likely that the undemocratic Supreme Court will overturn the Roe versus Wade ruling, and that would leave individual states to decide whether abortion is legal or not. Excuse me. And New Mexico is currently one of 9 states in the United States that has a pre-Roe law or abortion ban on the books. For example, other states include Arizona and Alabama. So with that possibility of overturning of Roe, that would make the ban become law of the land, and essentially, it would criminalize abortion, make it a fourth-degree felony, and make outlaws of those seeking these essential medical procedures. And so what the Party for Socialism and Liberation is doing in Albuquerque is organizing this demand to repeal that the pre-Roe abortion ban is taken off the books once and for all. After all, both corporate-backed politicians from both parties have had 50 years to safeguard women's rights by repealing this ban, and the ban has remained largely obscured until this campaign. Raising awareness is such a huge component of this campaign.
I think there's a very important preemption to what we're going to see with the Supreme Court and how that will roll back the kind of abortion laws to these just really draconian level. So I'm wondering what the kind of balance of forces are within New Mexico in regard to this, because I feel like at this point there should be so kind of little pushback if we truly lived in a kind of country, a progressive country where, this was understood to have been a point of progress where abortion was legalized. You would think there would be very little pushback from, say, a so-called progressive party that the Democrats so often like to present themselves themselves as. You would think this would be kind of a common sense proposal, but in fact, it is not. And in fact, as we saw at the national level with the Democratic Party, often the Democrats are the first to kind of impose whatever the case may be, neoliberal austerity or other kind of conservative, basically Republican agendas. So I'm curious what the kind of balance of power is in New Mexico, and whether the Democratic Party or other of these kind of pseudo progressive Democratic Party affiliates are really feel the need to address this.
Yes, good question. So New Mexico has always been, I guess, what you would call a blue state. We have just came out of a very conservative governor administration with Susana Martinez, who was very pro-life. This is why we're having a rally actually at the Roundhouse on January 15th, right at the legislative session for 2019. Like I had said about both corporate-backed parties and politicians not safeguarding women's rights by repealing this law, because if you look at history, I mean, both parties have been very complicit and very willing to enact the restrictions ever since the ruling of Roe versus Wade in 1973. I mean, there have been restrictions upon restrictions since 1973, and they've happened both under Democratic and Republican leadership, both in the White House and the Supreme Court. And as we saw with the midterm elections in November, there was this push in corporate media saying, well, if we want to protect abortion rights, we have to push for this blue wave. And I think it comes from this posturing on part of the Democratic Party as the sort of protectors of reproductive rights and abortion rights. And history shows otherwise, actions show otherwise. There's a long history of Democratic leadership and politicians being very willing to make concessions and do whatever it takes and throw women's issues and rights just under the bus to gain any type of electoral influence. I mean, we see that especially in southern states where Democrats, despite their grandstanding as the party for being pro-choice, will try and get pro-life Democrats elected in those states to gain influence. And I mean, there's such a long history of those kind of concessions and just really be complicit in the chipping away of access to abortion services. I mean, we saw that, since 1977, with both houses of Congress upholding the Hyde Amendment, which was signed under the presidential administration of Jimmy Carter, which cut off federal Medicaid funding for low-income women's access to abortion, not allowing Medicaid to pay for those services. And we've seen that under the Bill Clinton administration. I mean, even as governor, he had signed a parental notification bill, and those are like the kind of bills and laws that help slowly chip away at abortion rights and lead to more extreme measures to totally dismantle the legal status of abortion in the United States. And they're completely unconstitutional.
The Democratic Party actually has a pretty awful record of undercutting all this. If people are interested in learning more about how the Democratic Party has essentially undercut abortion rights, I think a good starting place that I know of personally would be there a couple episodes of there's a podcast called Citations Needed. It's a media criticism podcast that they have a couple episodes. It's by Adam Johnson and Nima Shirazi, and they have a couple episodes on shifting media representations of abortion. Episodes 48 and 49 that I think are definitely worth checking out, that shows how in the mid-1990s there was this kind of rhetorical and cultural shift on the issue of abortion, especially with Democrats conceding the language and kind of the moral high ground to the extremist anti-abortion, anti-reproductive rights, the right wing. And of course, that was spearheaded as much as by the Clintons as much as anyone. And in many ways, the balance of power within the Democratic Party is still, as we've seen, in the kind of Clintonite neoliberal camp. Understanding that there's such a kind of dearth of interest in the Democratic Party even being progressive on the legislative level. The other kind of part that always gets talked about here is kind of the judicial level with the Supreme Court and with courts in general. I think there's this kind of this sense among many progressive-minded people that there's not really a structural problem, but in fact that the problem is simply that we don't have the right people in this or that system. When in reality, if you look at the nature of the Supreme Court, when you've used the term undemocratic, I think that's very important for us to understand that for a country that at least in theory was founded on the abolishment of monarchy, to have this system of 9 appointed, unelected judges that essentially are able to override at will the kind of law of the land and that serve lifetime appointments. I think that really is as monarchical a system as any. And, for those people who are kind of waiting for the Supreme Court to be stacked with just the right number of Ruth Bader Ginsburgs or whatnot, this idea that if you just put the right people in these offices, whether it's the presidency or whether it's the Congress or especially with the Supreme Court, if you just put the quote unquote the right people in there, that somehow you'll get the kind of progressive change you want is really incredibly misguided. Because when we look at, I'd say that when we look at the context of Roe versus Wade, that was a really conservative Supreme Court that issued that. When we look at the kind of civil rights gains of the 1960s, those were actually really reactionary Supreme Courts. The difference, from my understanding, was really that the balance of power in the country was different, that in fact there was a large, kind of a working class movement, that there was a large kind of anti-racist, anti-war movement, and that those things kind of forced the hand of these kind of systems of power to kind of force these concessions. It wasn't a reliance upon the system itself. It was in fact pressure against the system. I'm wondering how that's worked for the Party for Socialism and Liberation as you tackle this kind of issue in New Mexico.
Yeah, great comment. And that's very true. And a huge component to this campaign in terms of our message is about the Supreme Court. I mean, it was never democratic to begin with. And when I mentioned Kavanaugh and the nomination of Kavanaugh and the likeliness of Roe versus Wade being overturned, I mean, we can't say that the addition of Kavanaugh now is somehow eroding the structure of the Supreme Court and the its characteristics. Absolutely not. I mean, Kavanaugh, inclusion of Kavanaugh now is only a continuation of the Supreme Court's history of being a very reactionary force. I mean, we can't look at whatever progressive elements go through the court as being a sign of it being democratic and having the working class, our interests in mind. Like you said, those come from popular militant organization amongst working class people, and that was definitely the case with Roe versus Wade. And that's why it's so important with this campaign, and especially the rally on January 15th outside of the New Mexico Roundhouse for the 2019 legislation, to be aware of how the structure of the Supreme Court and other legislation in New Mexico, because in New Mexico, there had already been a bill about 2 years ago that went into a legislative session to get this bill repealed, and it completely died, and it died quietly. So we're trying to make sure that, first of all, we need to raise awareness about the issue and make sure that there's now a bill going in again to repeal this ban, that it doesn't die quietly, and that politicians are held accountable for that. And that is such a huge component to this campaign. And ever since the campaign has started, more people are becoming more invested to see whether or not this ban is repealed.
There's sort of an energy and finally an understanding now that things need to be pushed all the way, that there can't be these kind of half measures, that even though abortion was technically legalized for so long, we saw so many states putting in such repressive legislation that in fact it kind of de facto legalized abortion, or made it so hard to get access to,
Right.
for all intents and purposes, like, states were able to kind of impose their own repressive measures. So have you seen this kind of change in the way people kind of think about this as not just sort of a thing that needs to be sort of de facto legalized, but also that we need to have like kind of the full support of, like kind of full government support behind this?
Absolutely. I mean, as the past, I would say, decade, where we've seen especially hugely chipping away of abortion rights. And I mean, in 2018 alone, there were dozens of restrictions passed in several states, but that doesn't reflect working class people, where there's an overwhelming support for abortion rights, and especially abortion access. Isn't like abortion is, I don't think, a divisive issue amongst working class people. In fact, here in New Mexico, especially in rural parts of New Mexico, where I think sometimes is characterized as being conservative, I think it was over something like 54% of rural New Mexicans said in one survey that abortion access is just does not exist, and we need more access to abortion. In fact, I think there was something like 94% of counties in New Mexico don't have a abortion clinic. And another component in demanding for this ban to be repealed once and for all, there's also a demand to make abortion accessible, and it should be free, it should be safe and legal. And a big part of that too is talking about abortion access, and how, and this also reflects a national trend where I think it's like 1 in 5 women have to travel miles and miles just to receive access to reproductive services and access to abortion services. I mean, we see this with Texas and New Mexico. Texas, which has so many restrictions on abortion that were, passed within the last 2 years, so many women from Texas actually have to travel to New Mexico to receive abortion services. And even women in New Mexico, especially in the rural parts of New Mexico, have to go to more metropolitan areas in New Mexico to receive those services. So, like you had said, when we're talking about abortion, a big part of it too is talking about access. Just because abortion is legalized, it doesn't mean that. There's so many barriers for many women to receive these, again, important medical procedures.
There's really so much there into, understanding the kind of what we might call the intersections here of abortion, not just as not just as a reproductive rights issue, but also as sort of a class issue, as a race issue, understanding how those kind of interconnect to the point where this has to be kind of an issue for all working people. And I think it absolutely is. And I think this is going to be a valuable campaign. So as the what's the sort of timetable here for putting this repeal forward? What sort of hopes do you have as you kind of see this play out in kind of the coming either the coming weeks, coming months, or coming years?
Yeah, so the legislative session begins in January, and that's really the big focus there. But once the legislative session ends, the fight there doesn't end. If it's passed, we still need to fight for abortion access, and if it's not passed, well, we keep the fight going.
For those who might be interested, you can find more information on the Party for Socialism and Liberation Albuquerque branch. If you type in Party for Socialism and Liberation Albuquerque or PSL Albuquerque, you can find the Facebook page there. I believe PSL Albuquerque also has a Twitter, correct?
Yes.
The rally is called Rally Repeal New Mexico's Abortion Ban. Is going to be a real important stuff. So we have a few minutes left. I think the implications for this are pretty wide reaching in terms of what this could mean, especially for other southern states where this is broadcast. If you're just tuning in, you're listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM in Austin, and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. We're also available as a podcast wherever podcasts are podded. We're talking with Candice Yanez, an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. We have a few minutes left to sort of wrap up anything else that we might not have covered that you think is really kind of vital to understanding this push for abortion rights, not just in New Mexico, but also kind of across the country, like, anything either kind of theoretically or in practice that we might have missed so far?
What I would like to touch upon a little more, I think we were talking about it earlier, about how abortion is, a right basically on paper, but in reality, not so much. Ensuring that abortion is a right, not just on paper, but in real life, means again, militant action and organization, and it's only through systematic change that abortion and women's rights are made essentially are realized, and we saw that with any form of a revolution in other countries, like in the Soviet Union, where right after the 1917 revolution, automatically all forms of women's rights became, the law: access to abortion, access to childcare, access to better wages. These are all part of the fight when we're talking about, women's rights, and it's a wide-ranging issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for us to also have that kind of vision of a society where we're not constantly fighting against, the kind of powers that be to protect the kind of half measures that pass for rights, whether that's the kind of half measure that is the healthcare system here, whether that's the half measures of, public transportation or abortion or kind of all these things. The truth is that the wealth of society is such that, with a restructuring restructuring of industry and with a restructuring of just the way society kind of functions, we could turn that wealth to the public good, and we could, in many ways, end so many of the great systemic sufferings that happen under this kind of capitalist system. Such a big part of that in understanding women's rights and reproductive rights is understanding this kind of alternative vision for when this is kind of a right that is enshrined, within the Constitution of a country. It should be a right that's enshrined not just in word but also in deed, with a kind of government restructuring, with a just social restructuring and economic restructuring, where really the wealth that society has built can be put towards solving so many of these problems. And I think the lack of access to abortion and the way that that so many of the so-called progressives continue to kind of skirt around the truth that we need access to abortion. Like, that's such a huge problem that needs to be addressed and that can be addressed under socialism. I'm wondering, if you have anything to sort of add to that kind of vision of what like a socialist understanding of kind of women's and reproductive rights would be beyond what you kind of already mentioned about the Soviet Union.
Yeah, thank you. Great comment. Yes. So I think a big part of that too is I think sometimes the issue is looked as protecting abortion rights as abortion being a moral issue, and I think a big part of ensuring that abortion rights are protected. I mean, in a new restructuring of government, it should be understood that abortion is it's an essential medical procedure, and we should also understand how it's often pathologized, and we see that today with so many bills, such as I think it was the fetal heartbeat bill, and also mandated question of why a woman is getting an abortion, having to fill paperwork like that, and waiting periods for women to decide if the decision is the correct decision for them. Again, these are all things that pathologize and really demonize this important medical procedure that is an abortion. And it is also important to understand how abortion is also, for women to have make decisions not only over their bodies but their lives, and that greatly influences also so many aspects to a woman's life, such as her job, education, and other things. So we should, abortion is so essential to women's rights and ensuring women's independence.
We have been talking with Candice Yanez, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The Albuquerque branch is holding a rally to repeal New Mexico's abortion ban. You can find the info on the PSL Albuquerque's Facebook page, as well as Twitter, across social media. That's going to be on January 15th. So thank you, Candice, very much for coming on, and hope to have you on again soon.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates out of KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. People's Republic is also available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. Now we turn to the struggle for reproductive rights in Austin. We are joined in person to talk about the Austin Women's Rally, which is coming up on January 19th. We are joined to talk about this and much more with Paula Treach-Cheney, who's one of the co-founders and the media relations volunteer with the Austin Women's Rally. Thank you, Paula, very much for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate the time.
Yeah, very glad to have you on. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the history of the Austin Women's Rally, what the kind of issues it stood for, and what you feel the kind of need for this rally has been, historically and today?
Well, 6 years ago, in the aftermath of the Wendy Davis People's Filibuster, many of us were involved in the People's Filibuster and were at the Capitol during a lot of those hearings. And after that event, we felt the need to maintain the community and to keep people engaged on this issue. We know with our current administration in our state that these issues are not going to go away. They continue to make attempts to limit reproductive rights. Matter of fact, there's a case going to court in Austin today that there'll be a ruling on. So for the last 6 years, we have held this rally. It used to be strictly a Roe v. Wade commemoration. This year, because there are so many other issues affecting women, we have expanded our focus, and we will be talking about more intersectional issues, everything from reproductive rights to pay inequality to the maternal mortality rate in Texas and the United States, to all issues and all perspectives that speak to women in the state of Texas and around the country.
Yeah, so much of that is absolutely vital that we understand, the various kind of intersections and understand that reproductive rights are also a matter of kind of a, race and class. And, that really, this encompasses so much, and that the access to abortion needs to be free, legal, and easily available. And I think, so much of that gets lost. We just talked about kind of the struggle in New Mexico, where New Mexico has had essentially a law on the books since I believe it was the late 60s. I'm forgetting the exact year, but essentially it predates Roe versus Wade, and it's a law in New Mexico that makes abortion a felony. It essentially criminalizes abortion. So in so many states, there are these sort of kind of like pre-Roe v. Wade laws that are still on the books that provide this now looming threat if the Supreme Court under Kavanaugh does with Kavanaugh does overturn Roe v. Wade. And then on the other hand, we've seen assault kind of post Roe v. Wade, even though when abortion is not a de jure criminalized, it is in fact de facto criminalized or legalized in so many ways. So I think for those people who may have forgotten that this kind of struggle around reproductive rights that happened around the time of the kind of what crystallized in Wendy Davis's stand and whatnot, but what was really a people's movement. That was really such a powerful struggle, and that was one of the points at which I was kind of sold. I was not like a very high profile participant, but I was at a couple of the protests around that time, and that was one of my own kind of radicalizing moments here in Austin of realizing this is where power is vested. It's vested in the people when the people come together en masse to kind of fight for what it is we need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And eternal vigilance is what we have to practice at this point. We know that the statewide administration and our statewide office holders, by and large, are very hostile towards women's reproductive rights. They've made that very, very clear. Matter of fact, the new legislative session begins tomorrow. To my understanding, that there are already, I believe, about a half a dozen bills that have already been filed that will either make abortion illegal in Texas or place even more restrictive regulations against it. And, as I said, there's a court case in Austin still remnant from some of the things that they passed a couple of years ago. So the leadership of our state is quite willing to make laws that they know will not withstand the test of a legal challenge, but they will still, for ideological purposes, and because it riles up their base around the issue, they will still propose and pass those laws in our legislature and, perpetuate women as second-class citizens, holding them economic hostage, holding them, a hostage to maternity, which is what we have worked for the last 50 years of the women's movement to be able to say that women are independent human beings and deserve the right to make their own decisions regarding their own lives, their own bodies, and their own futures. And we have continued to work these last 6 years in concert with each other and the many advocacy groups that there are out there to keep our eyes on these laws, keep our eyes on the hearing, keep our eyes on the lawmakers, and let them know that although they may win the battle, they will lose the war.
Yeah, I think so. I definitely believe there's kind of a renewed push in many ways. There's a renewed kind of sense of energy around, women's liberation issues in a way that kind of lay dormant, I think, for many years when, in fact, conditions have continued to kind of worsen in so many ways. I'm wondering if you don't mind giving us sort of a rundown of what sort of challenges people face if someone were to try and, get an abortion here anywhere kind of in the state of Texas, because obviously there's the distance, there's the so many numerous kind of regulations that have gone over. So what really does that process look like, and what are the challenges there?
Well, if you don't live in a major urban center, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, you likely do not have a facility that will perform an abortion available within 100 miles. Part of the challenge of the reproductive rights justice movement is to step in and provide transportation to women who face that barrier and that challenge. There are also the trap laws that were passed that required that all clinic facilities maintain the same standards as an ambulatory surgical center. And as you know, those regulations are very stringent for reasons of safe medical practice. But abortion, by and large now, in the first 12 weeks is a combination of prescriptions that a woman must take at a certain time segment, and not a medical procedure per se at all, thus making those regulations burdensome, expensive to comply with, and highly unnecessary. They also strip for example, there's one famous clinic organization that had to repaint their walls white because ambulatory surgical centers must have white walls.
Wow.
Apparently their lavender walls were just too kind and welcoming, for the shaming of our legislators. And as I said, and then you talk about the 24-hour waiting period, the mandatory ultrasound. For anyone who's ever undergone a vaginal ultrasound, people talk like it's a very benign procedure. Personally, I had one. I will tell you that it required medication to ameliorate the after effects and the pain that was caused by that ultrasound. So the regulations that they make serve no reasonable purpose. They infantilize women. Who was it? Molly Ivins that said that somebody just swaggers across an abortion clinic and decides, hey, I'll terminate my pregnancy today, or I'm sorry, I'm misquoting her terribly. But it's not a decision that women make lightly. It is, and it's horribly insulting to make women sit through recitals of patently false information that is published by our state that gives people, as I said, it just is meant to cause shame. It's meant to infantilize women. It's meant to put women in a subservient position to the real adults that are making the decisions.
for people who don't understand how big Texas is, outside of a few kind of large cities, other areas can be, I forget the kind of statistics as to how far the nearest abortion clinic might be or reproductive health clinic might be. But it's a very, very long way. We're talking about, a massive drive, almost like driving across the country in many parts of Texas. For so many people already kind of poverty stricken, already with, no source of income, or who are struggling in, the poorer rural areas of Texas, that essentially amounts to an abortion ban.
Absolutely.
In all kind of intents and purposes.
We have estimated, I'm an armchair economist in my real life. And I estimated if a woman lives 500 miles away from the nearest clinic, that between the cost of transportation, the economic loss of time off work, the cost of childcare, if there are other children, the cost of lodging for the night, meals, that an abortion can cost you in the state of Texas up to $2,000. And that is, with most Americans, with 40% of Americans not able to meet a $400 emergency expense, without turning to loans, credit cards, things like that. That is an economic barrier to access. And, while all of these organizations have worked very hard to remove those barriers, as long as we have legislators intent on closing clinics down and making abortion as unavailable as possible, those barriers will remain for some women who won't know who to ask, how to ask, where to go for help.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you who are just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates out of KOOP 91.7 FM in Austin, and is also broadcasting on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. We are also available as a podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, wherever else podcasts are potted. We are talking with Paula Treese Cheney, one of the co-founders and the media relations volunteer with the Austin Women's Rally, about the upcoming, I believe it's 6th annual Austin Women's Rally that's going to take place at
on the south steps of the Capitol, January 19th from 2 to 5.
We talked a little bit about the history of this kind of emerging out of the struggle around the regulation that essentially, as we were talking about, forced abortion clinics to have the same regulations as ambulatory surgical centers. There was this huge, really, really powerful kind of people's movement that for, I believe it was several days, essentially overtook the Capitol to the point where they were unable to pass legislation because this incredibly draconian legislation, they were unable to pass it a couple times because of because the people essentially drowned them out. It was such an unpopular thing that they were essentially drowned out, and eventually that movement was kind of repressed to the point they had to bring in essentially state repression in order to get this incredibly unpopular legislation passed. So that was kind of the beginning of this particular kind of struggle, this particular women's rally. I'm wondering how it's sort of evolved to you. What sort of what different things you've prioritized has changed, and what sort of strategies have changed for you as you try and really make the best possible difference here?
Well, as I said, this year we have gone from a strictly Roe v. Wade commemoration to a rally that is going to speak to all women's issues and the intersectionality of all of those issues. We're going to talk about everything from childcare and economic issues to what happens when women who have not participated in the workforce are alone and retired. What's going to happen there? We also talk about issues of, as I said, maternity leave, maternal mortality. All of these issues don't exist in isolation. They're all a part of most of our lives, just as they've been a part of my life. for example, I wasn't able to. I first noticed that the legislator was doing something funny when they passed the mandatory ultrasound bill. But at the time, I had 2 small children at home, and I was a sole caregiver for my elderly disabled mother. And so while I participated as I could in, writing letters and emails and things like that, the session that happened with Wendy Davis, I finally was free of that elder care responsibility, and my children were both in school. So I could fully participate. And so I started showing up for the hearings. And I signed up with a couple of the advocacy groups that will notify you by email when votes or committee hearings are coming up. And we started showing up. And we all started showing up and kept showing up. And by the time we got to the last day of the session, when you're right, they tried to play hinky tricks with the clock. They tried to drown Letitia Van de Putte out. They tried all kinds of horrible tactics to pass this vote. And they ultimately did. The governor called a special session back, and that's the one and only thing that they did was pass HB2. But in the meantime, we're still organizing. We're still talking about it. We're still building those communities. We're still keeping our eyes focused, and we have kept our eyes focused for the last 5 or so 6 years. And as we go into this legislative session, we're all going to be there again. And we will, those of us that can be there because of the vagaries of life and things like that, will speak for the ones who can't be. I know what it's like to be at home with 2 toddlers just dying to be able to go do something like this. And now that my children are teenagers, I have a lot more flexibility. They don't need me every minute of the day. So, and I would encourage everyone to use your voice, to do what you can. Never underestimate and never make the mistake of thinking that you're not doing anything because you can only do a little. Every little bit helps. It really does.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think, I'm always interested to see how the kind of understanding of popular resistance sort of ebbs and flows depending on kind of the political and economic circumstances. And I think we're, we were in a period around, early 2017 with the inauguration of Trump, where that sense of kind of popular mobilization was very very strong. And we've seen these other, seen these other kind of high points in sort of these spontaneous uprisings with, for instance, with Occupy Wall Street, with Black Lives Matter. We are definitely within an era where these spontaneous uprisings continue to kind of happen. And now we have, the Yellow Vests movement within France and within other countries, as sort of conflicted as the ideals tend to be within that kind of spontaneous movement. It nonetheless, I think, is a very powerful, not just symbol of discontent, but it gets things done. That showing of popular discontent, that mass mobilization, that wins things in a way that I think is very powerful.
Let's look back to the last vote that they took to dismantle the Affordable Care Act and the one senator that it took to vote it down. And the majority of the lawmakers would have voted on party lines were it not for the fact that their constituents have risen up and organized phone calls and letters and emails to tell these elected representatives that if they do not speak for us in these critical cases, that we will make sure that they don't speak for us ever again. And that is the point that we're going to have to make with quite a few more of them. I think that quite a few of them got an object lesson in November in that ideal. And I hope very strongly for the future that we will have more people participating as more people are adversely affected under the current administration.
Yeah, I think in many ways, the kind of draconian policies sort of, they create their own sort of resistance. Like they, when you have people who are relatively comfortable, when you have people who may really be struggling, may really be exploited, but generally like they're able to sort of scrape by, you have people who are complacent enough, not sort of out of laziness, but simply complacent enough because, they don't feel that sense of urgency. But as the kind of economic conditions change, as the social conditions and political conditions change, whatever these draconian policies that come in, however it is they affect the population, they then sort of they call into existence their own resistance in so many powerful ways. I think we're seeing now.
Absolutely. And I think that when we make big changes, we will see big results as far as people being able to engage with the political process. When you're an average worker that is working 2 full-time jobs in order to keep food on your table, you don't have a lot of time or mental bandwidth to think about bigger things or the tax policy that's going to mess you up, and the child care allowance that's no longer there, for example, or whatever. You just don't have the time or the energy or the strength to be able to speak about where you are. That's why I think a living minimum wage is such an important thing, because it would free so many people to be able to use their voices in a constructive way. And this is a democracy that we supposedly live in. We're supposed to have everyone's voices heard. And it seems as if with the, I don't even want to say his name, because that more and more people are actually being driven out of our democratic process because of economic necessity. And that's a shame. That's not who we are. That's not America.
So I think we have a couple minutes left. I know kind of before we started recording here, before we started broadcasting, we were talking a lot about an issue that's passionate to both of us, which is kind of what's happened with education as well. And to me, this is a very related issue, because education, even though obviously occupation should not be gendered, education in our current society tends to be gendered female, especially sort of public school education, K through 12. And so that gendering of education female allows for the kind of hyper exploitation, and essentially what we're seeing is sort of a gutting of the public school system that's been going on for the past several decades. At the same time, though, the interesting thing to me has been that teachers have risen up strongest. The real core of the teacher uprisings has been in these incredibly what would be called quote unquote red states that are considered very reactionary, with hyper reactionary sort of state governments. So
like Michigan, like Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Yes. And if our Texas teachers would rise up and follow their example, Texas education would look a lot different than it does today. Our teachers are under assault just as women are. They're told that they have to follow this very strict tested curriculum, that their worth as a teacher is solely judged on how many of their students can bubble the right response on a Scantron form. And that's not teaching, that's not learning, and it's not education. And it's a shame to me that that people don't recognize that our public education system is our most successful investment in the advancement of American society. The founding of the public school system in the United States, it was part of what sent the United States into growing the greatest middle class that the world has ever known. And it is shameful and shocking to me that we now accept that, or so many people believe that public schools are evil, doctrinaire places that you propagate all sorts of sinister ideas like equality, and we've got a whole system of people who are determined, including our current Secretary of Education, determined to dismantle the public school system. It's absolutely horrific.
Yeah, so from my understanding, you're going to, among the other people speaking at the Austin Women's Rally, which again is going to be on January 19th, held at the South Steps of the Capitol from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Among the other different people who are going to speak there are going to be kind of people speaking on behalf of Texas educators, correct?
Absolutely, because it's one of the issues that affect women most acutely. Women do tend still in our society to be the people that make decisions regarding the children's education and do all the research. And it's a terrible thing now. For example, I believe in the public school system. I come from generations of teachers, even though I'm not one myself. I believe in public education. I'm a product of public education. But when we started to put our children in school 15 or so years ago, we faced a lot of peer pressure and peer condemnation among our parent peers for choosing to send our children to the public school, for a variety of reasons. And our public schools should be the shining monuments to democracy that they once were. And they should be as well funded as Harvard is. And that's how we will continue to grow and thrive as a society, by investing in our youngest citizens.
Absolutely. So in our last couple of minutes, is there anything else that you'd like to sort of touch on that we haven't yet talked about, either around the Austin Women's Rally or just generally sort of the fight for both reproductive rights and women's rights in general?
You can find our organization on Facebook at TRRR. That's also, you can search it under the Austin Women's Rally. We are looking for volunteers if you would like to volunteer for our event. We are also going to have a period products drive during the rally this year. We will be collecting period supplies for distribution to local homeless shelters and other women's organizations that serve women who lack the funds to be able to afford. The typical period costs a typical woman $20 a month, and that's $20 that may be hard to come by. So I appreciate people being attentive to that as well. The event is open to the public. There is public parking available in the state garages that are nearby the Capitol.
Yeah, that's once again the final time. That's going to be the Austin Women's Rally, the 2019 Austin Women's Rally, taking place on January 19th at the at the Capitol, the Texas State Capitol in Austin, rather, hosted by the Texas Reproductive Rights Rally. That's the name of the Facebook page. You can find all the information on Facebook and presumably other social media. We have been talking with Paula Treach Cheney. She's one of the co-founders and media relations volunteer with the Austin Women's Rally. Thank you again, Paula, for coming on.
Oh, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic is produced at KOOP Community Radio in Austin, Texas, and is also syndicated on WHIV 102.3 FM in New Orleans. You can find our show on SoundCloud, iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and Stitcher by typing in People's Republic. Or you can visit us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX. Thanks for listening as we report on the global struggle for social and economic justice. We are out of here.